This is a moment in Jewish history. The Jewish holiday of Shavuot celebrates the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. And with it, there are many foods associated. And to help me talk about food and history is Joel Haber, licensed tour guide and host of the 18 Jewish Foods podcast. Joel, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
Okay, now there's something a little embarrassing that I want to admit to everybody, which is that I don't like cheesecake. I mean, I don't like the taste or the texture, and every Shavuot people say, oh, you don't like cheesecake, but it's not Shavuot without cheesecake. So you're the expert, so maybe you could explain to us the history of cheesecake. Why are dairy foods associated with Shavuot, and what is the significance?
So, when you say that you don't like cheesecake, I have to ask if you're like lactose intolerant or something like that. Or maybe you just haven't had the right cheesecake yet. But honestly, it's an interesting point because there isn't necessarily anything specific connected with cheesecake. In fact, the custom of having dairy is something that has obscure origins. If you do the research, I've come across at least 15 different explanations for why we have the custom of eating dairy on Shavuot. And if everyone gives the same response, usually to me that might have some truth in it. But if everybody gives you a different reason, probably none of them are accurately the true reason why we do it. And so I don't think that you have to feel any guilt about not eating cheesecake because there isn't any commandment or special thing about cheesecake.
Yes, unlike other holidays where Passover you have matzah, other foods associated with it. And Shavuot is interesting because it doesn't really have so much associated with it. Like on Sukkot, you have the lulav and etrog. Shavuot doesn't have a thing, but maybe cheesecake has become the thing.
Yeah, and I think that that's part of why it developed. Shavuot traditionally was different than the other, especially than the two other pilgrimage festivals of Sukkot and Pesach or Passover, but even different than other smaller holidays like Hanukkah or Purim or whatever, in that, first of all, it is one day, so that it has in common with Purim. And most importantly, at its core, it was a temple-based holiday rather than a holiday that you celebrate at home. And therefore, the rituals associated with it, and there were rituals such as the Bikurim, the first fruits ceremony, all took place at the temple. So what happens to the holiday when the temple gets destroyed? When the temple is destroyed, you can still eat in a sukkah and you can still have a seder, but you can't bring the first fruits to the temple if the temple doesn't exist. And I think that what happened is that we started to look for ways to invest the holiday with new meanings. In fact, what you mentioned at the beginning is that the holiday celebrates the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. That is not its original connection. I'm not saying it's wrong, but originally in the Torah, it makes no mention of associating this holiday with the Torah. It associates it simply with the beginning of the wheat harvest. It's a purely agricultural festival originally. And we didn't give up the agricultural aspect, but it is no longer tied to the temple, so we need to look for new meanings. So we have the giving of the Torah, and we develop new food customs, such as the dairy custom.
That makes sense. And of course, there's some Hasidic traditions where Torah is associated with milk.
Right? That's one of about the 15 that I saw. Yeah, that the numerical value of the word for chalav, for milk, is equal to the numerical equivalent of, I forget what word, but it couldn't be Torah, but something like that. Yes, you're absolutely right.
Now, you sent me an article that talked about Arnold Rubin, the creator of the Reuben sandwich, and also allegedly the creator of cheesecake. And I saw one article that called it Jewish cheesecake. So maybe that spread around the Jewish world, or maybe you can give me some more insight.
Let me answer the second question first. When you said about the Jewish cheesecake, I think that relates to the fact that cheesecake is a very old food. I think it even goes back to the Roman Empire, Roman cuisine. But what I would call New York style cheesecake, the heavy cheesecake with cream cheese, all of that is invented in New York and invented seemingly by Jews. The specific point about Reuben inventing it, I did not write that article. I was interviewed in that article, and that's something that I would call culinary mythology. a lot of things in food history are not certain. We have stories and they may be true. I'm not saying he didn't invent it, but I would say that there's probably others who would also make the claim to have invented it. It doesn't really matter who invented it. It is certainly something that was associated with Jewish delis in New York City and grew from there and pushed along, of course, by frozen cheesecake created by the Sara Lee Company, another Jew. That certainly is true. But who invented it, I don't know. I don't know if Reuben actually invented it.
I do want to talk more about history and Judaism, but first you mentioned maybe I haven't had the right cheesecake. So what is your favorite cheesecake and what are you going to eat on Shavuot?
So for me, a lot of the cheesecake that is sold in this country, in Israel, is not something that I take to very much. I'm a big fan of the New York cheesecake. I like that rich cheesecake. My mom makes a really good one, so usually I get it from her, although one year at least I did make my own. That's what I like. But I do want to go back to like your dislike of the cheesecake. That honestly, the reason that cheesecake became popular is not because there's something special about cheesecake, but because it is made of dairy. And unlike Hanukkah, which has two or three very centrally, universally eaten foods, and Purim, which has universally eaten foods, Shavuot does not, because it's a one-day home-based holiday where people eat at home. You know, you're not going out to stores to buy stuff. Anything that is made of dairy, people will eat. Kada, which is from Kurdistan, burekas, khachapuri, which is Georgian, different types of cheesecake, lasagnas, baked ziti, doesn't matter. So everybody makes their own thing. And it's not like you're breaking with tradition if instead of having cheesecake, you eat dairy babka or something like that, you know?
I might like that better.
I'm sure. You know, Boutique Central sells them made with butter. So those are really, really good.
Now, you mentioned the Bikurim, and I found some old articles about the Bikurim ceremony, which means first fruit, and I saw some interesting old black and white photos of the children carrying the baskets of fruit. I mean, we don't really do that today, but back in the pre-state days, you know, the kibbutzniks and the moshavniks, that was a huge deal that every Shavuot they would march with the fruits.
I don't know a ton about it, but what I would say is I would put it into the context of the fact that when the early Zionists were helping to build this state, largely through kibbutzim and moshavim, what we saw was that rather than a full rejection of Jewish culture and history, even by seculars, there was maybe sort of like picking out the things from our history that spoke to them. And as farmers, after a long period of not having that many Jewish farmers, this was a way of retapping back into the agricultural roots of our people. And this is probably the best holiday to do that because, as we mentioned, or as I mentioned, at its core, this is an agricultural festival. And so they looked at our Jewish heritage in Israel of being agriculturalists, and they said, this is something that we will recreate. Yes, we're not going to the temple. There isn't a temple, and that makes it maybe more palatable to secular Jews. But we're going to have a ceremony where we bring first fruits, bundles of wheat and things like that from our fields that we grew to Jerusalem. And rather than going to the temple, they went to, I think at times, the Knesset, and then more frequently to what's known as the National Institutions buildings, the head of JNF and things like that. And so I think it was a way of picking from the past, from our heritage, something that spoke to them and something that connected it to the land of Israel today.
Well, I like that. And I wish you a happy Shavuot. And thank you for coming on. Your podcast is 18 Jewish Foods.
Yes, it is. You can find it anywhere you stream or on my website.
And your website is tasteofjew.com.
That's correct. Thanks for having me.
Joel, thank you for coming on. This has been a moment in Jewish history. My name is Ben Bresky. And for questions or comments, you can check out benbresky.substack.com. Thank you for listening, and shalom.